Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I hope you're having a nice weekend. I just wanted to do this video as a way to just give you some information about the quiz and also to share some information about the Treaty of Versailles. That way you have some of that content under your belt, and any questions and things like that, just send me an email and I'll make sure to get back to you this weekend. A few things about the quiz. The style of the quiz will be primarily multiple choice and then also some kind of open-ended questions, some that will be brief, open-ended questions, and then one longer one at the end, just so you have an idea of the style of the quiz. There is a study guide on Schoology, and the study guide has a few different content topics to spend some time with in preparation, just kind of going through the framework of World War I a little bit, in a chronological sense, from the beginnings and the causes of the war all the way through to the Paris Peace Conference. There's a few texts that I'll recommend to you to take a look at. One is the Brinkley Text. This is posted with the study guide. The Brinkley Text is from an American history textbook, so it's really going to give you some information about reasons why the United States got involved in the war in 1917, some of the challenges of American neutrality prior to that, and also some information about the U.S. role in the war and the Paris Peace Conference, of course, the 14 points and Woodrow Wilson's compromises. There's also some information about the war at home, so things that relate to issues of civil liberties, for example, and freedom of speech, some of those particular topics. There's also a few videos that I posted throughout the unit that you can also refer to. There's a second text that I called the Mckay Text. This is a text that can give you a little bit broader of a global history for World War I. Some of you might have an interest in some of the topics that relate more to world history, for example, the Russian Revolution and some of the civil war that ensues in Russia might be of interest. The Armenian genocide, something that we didn't get to spend a lot of time on in class. If you have a question about it, ask about it. But that's something that's covered in the Mckay Text, and also some information further about the Paris Peace Conference, especially from the groups that perhaps had an interest in self-determination, so things that might be relevant to the discussion that we're having in class. But in terms of the quiz, things that you can use the Mckay source for that would help you would be the section in the beginning of the Mckay text that's really dedicated to the causes of the war. There's some background on militarism, nationalism, imperialism, and whatnot. And then there's also a description of the July crisis. So some of that could be helpful if you're looking for kind of an outline to that. There's also the reading that you use for your project known as the Long Fuse, and that's also posted for you. So feel free to use that as well. And then there's a section on the Paris Peace Conference, and because some of the agendas of Britain or France or whatever might be touched lightly in the Brinkley text, you might find that a little bit more detail in Mckay, and that way you also just have it, sometimes the maps and some of the focus, even the timeline of some of the battles. I just have a little bit more global context. And again, you might have an interest in pursuing some of that. One thing, in addition, we didn't get to talk a lot about in class was the context of the influenza that's happening at the same time as the war. And there's just a great amount of effects in terms of on soldiers, but of course on regular citizens too, something that we have an appreciation for now in our own pandemic. And so if you have an interest in that, you'll see some content about that in the Mckay text also. So a few things about the study guide. There are some terms that we did talk about in class. I would focus mostly on those. So things about American neutrality and reasons for Woodrow Wilson to ultimately request from Congress a declaration of war, unrestricted submarine warfare, some of the other things that were changing that context. That's something that you had some resources on. That's definitely going to be a focus for the quiz. Also, some of the issues of the home front, that would be something else to spend some time with. And then also some of the issues related to the Paris Peace Conference and Wilson's 14 points. Some of the debate that existed at home between those who wanted to go to war, those who didn't want to go to war, and whatnot. There are a few sections that are mentions and things that you might just kind of be aware of. Some of the battles, the Battle of the Somme, some of the American battles like Chateau Thierry. Some of the battles are not going to be questions where you're going to need to know a great deal. Just some of the evolution of trench warfare and the way in which some of the technology plays out in some of, for example, the Battle of the Somme or the Battle of Verdun, which kind of speak to all-out, offenses that happen in the Western Front, where there's a great deal of attempt to try to overcome the stalemate and do something, kind of fierce and furious to break the stalemate. And of course, these efforts just lend themselves to horrific losses, a lot of really negative experiences for soldiers, and then lots of loss of life and whatnot. So we have some of the readings that you did related to the experience of soldiers and some of the disillusion, All Quiet on the Western Front, and sources like that kind of can help you there. But some of the terms that are on the sheet, like Race to the Sea, which is really kind of where we see the Allied and Central Powers setting up their trenches, or some of the specific battles, won't be the source of a lot of specific questions. Just recognize, is it the battle like kind of focused on an offensive or a counteroffensive, and which sides are involved, what might be significant about the losses in the battle in terms of it as a turning point. In the case of some of the American battles, we're just looking at ways in which the United States positioned itself toward the end of the war effort, and where the United States was significant. In a few other sections, there's some aspects of the war at home, in particular, some of the experiences of Black Americans. Just kind of keep in mind that the war being, this quote unquote war for democracy, creates some new experiences. In some cases, some Black soldiers are going to be fighting for France. That's not the majority of Black soldiers, but there is a regiment from Harlem, for example, that fights for France and fights heroically. And some of this information that gets shared with the American public, lends itself to what becomes like a growing effort in civil rights at home, democracy being fought for abroad, and soldiers returning home from war are going to see this, kind of post-war time through a lens of trying to increase civil liberties at home. And at the same time that there is going to be an increasing kind of demand for rights for Black Americans after World War I, we also see a migration of Black Americans from the South to the North, a very, very large, wide-scale migration. And so there's some demographic changes in American cities in the North, where there is more opportunity for industrial jobs, and there becomes a great deal of racial tension in the time period of 1918, 1919 into 1920, and that'll be a theme for the next decade. And so a few things that I'm going to use in this PowerPoint, but if you have questions about specific terms on the study guide, definitely ask. A few things in this video, primarily about the Treaty of Versailles. We know about Wilson's 14 points. We know we looked at those in class and some of the framework. And of course, Wilson is going to attend the Paris Peace Conference personally. He arrives in Paris to a lot of fanfare. There's a great deal of support for some of his ideals. People kind of see his plan as something that is going to be new, a pushback against imperialisms to some degree, and a pushback against things like secret treaties and, calling for more transparency. This will clearly, butt heads with some of the issues that the French and the British face, especially the French, being neighbors to Germany and fearing for not only having resentment for all of the destruction of France, but also fear of future German launches of attack. So that's an issue. Wilson does not include any Republicans in the Paris Peace Conference. Lots of historians will suggest that this is a mistake because when Wilson returns home with the finished, Paris or the Treaty of Versailles, including the League of Nations. It will not get passed by the U.S. Senate. And during the 1918 elections, there is a Republican takeover of the Senate, and Wilson just doesn't bring any Republicans into the involvement of the Paris Peace Conference. So likely a really big problem. And, on another note, Wilson had antagonized a lot of progressives at home by creating really, really rigid civil liberties laws. And so lots of people that might have supported the 14 points, including some progressives, find themselves at home being, not able to dissent against, the war effort, and they're bitter about it when the peace process unfolds. That group of people, are not really in the Wilson camp in the same way that they might have been had the civil liberties legislation been a little bit less so. So kind of a really big issue. Of course, World War I ends as a really horrifically destructive war. You can see some of the battlefield death numbers. If you look at France, for example, if you look at Russia, which took, the Eastern Front, in Germany as well, really, really horrific, casualty rates in terms of loss of life. And we also see that, in the case of Britain, this is going to include troops from a number of places, including India, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So lots and lots of societies across the world affected by this loss of life. All in all, about 8.5 million soldiers and 13 million civilians die as a result of the war. It is a very, very horrific war in terms of some of the ways in which soldiers return home. And of course, there's a great deal of challenges in every country where soldiers are returning home. Country like France, for example, had been utterly destroyed, and a lot of veterans returning home, see like their entire generation, in a space that is, demoralized. There are 20 million soldiers wounded during the war. Many of these injuries are incredibly significant. There was actually a review in the New York Times yesterday of a book that's coming out about the mask makers of World War I. So many young men had facial injuries that there was actually a demand to buy facial masks, right? It was actually a way, and there is a sense that there was a, kind of a societal shame about some soldiers who were so heavily disabled as a result of the war. There were actually specific benches placed in public for individuals who had been injured as a result of the war. And, the public would know these benches and know to avert their eyes for this purpose. So really, really horrific, really horrific injuries. Some of the things that also occur, of course, is there's a great deal of destruction. The war is going to cost in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Most national treasuries are empty, and again, in the case of France, in the case of Russia, places where the war actually gets fought, the level of civilian, affected is huge. There is things like France having no access to coal and things like that. Some of the industrial capacity of countries completely left, in a state of despair. The Paris Peace Conference, of course, which happens in 1919, is an attempt to rectify some of the outcome of the war and kind of right some of the wrongs. This conference, will be met by more than 20 countries, but of course, the big four are really going to lead the conference, which is a series of different meetings that happen under like various committees. So Woodrow Wilson, Vittorio Orlando, George Clemenceau, and David Lloyd George will become the big four. No, of course, Germany is not allowed to attend. They are served the treaty at the end of the conference, which is in May of 1919. In the case of the Treaty of Versailles, there's going to be specific treaties for Austria-Hungary, for Bulgaria, for the Ottoman Empire. So Germany will receive the Treaty of Versailles. Russia also kind of is not able to attend because of their leaving World War I. The major powers, of course, had very different agendas. France is and Clemenceau is really trying to act, on behalf of the French soldiers and what they fought for and whatnot. And he sees, threats in the future. So there's a great demand from the French to try to demilitarize and maybe even create the Rhineland as a buffer zone. That's something that France would like to see. France would like access to some of the German coal regions and wants to really limit any future power of Germany. This is going to include, limits to the military side.